So I'm here with Simon Tilfer from the Centre for European Reform in London. Reform in Europe seems to be a very popular thing at the moment. I imagine that you're quite busy. But are these reforms? We're through many reforms. There's this new stability fund and growth pact. Then no, there isn't that. And we're going to have a summit, but then the summit changes its mind, and we're going to have Eurobonds, and then we're not, and so on. What is all this? Is it adding up to anything? Are they actually reforming Europe, or are we kind of doing deck chairs on the Titanic?
I think it is largely an exercise of shifting the chairs, yeah. They have done more than appeared likely a couple of years ago, but they're still not addressing the underlying question, that this is a currency shared by largely independent countries. So in order to address the crisis, they need to integrate much more closely politically. Yet the longer the crisis goes on, the less likely we're going to see that kind of integration.
Mm-hmm. Now, why is it such a problem to share a currency? I mean, lots of countries use the US dollar, for example, and whether it's a good idea or not, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to cause the types of problems that this has caused. Why is that such a problem?
Well, countries that use or tie to the US dollar don't do so forever at the same exchange rate. Mm-hmm. Now, some countries have tied to the dollar over a lengthy period of time, but that's different from the euro, where you have a group of very heterogeneous economies sharing a currency over which they have no control. So to actually, if you take a country like Spain, Spain is now being treated as if it's borrowing in a foreign currency. So it's deep in a recession. Its economy has a big competitiveness problem, trade competitiveness problem. It's running a very big fiscal deficit. Its economy is highly depressed, and it's paying huge interest rates to borrow. And the reason for that is that investors no longer believe, or a lot of investors are no longer confident, that the Spanish economy is going to grow sufficiently quickly within the Eurozone to enable the country to service its debt, both public and private. Because of that, their borrowing costs are at prohibitively high levels. Now, that's largely a structure of the Eurozone. Investors would have concerns about the fiscal position of Spain, irrespective of whether it was in a currency union or not, but it wouldn't be paying anything like the borrowing costs it is now. The comparison is, say, the US or the UK, both of which have equally weak public finances, both of whom are paying about 2% to borrow debt over 10 years compared to Spain, which is paying 6% plus. Now, that is simply down to Spanish membership of the Eurozone, or rather the structure of the Eurozone and what it implies for members.
But beyond the problems created by this kind of foreign currency borrowing problem, even though it's their currency, is it possible for Spain to reform itself adequately in order to relieve the pressure, or do there need to be more sort of macro institutional changes to really solve the problem?
The problem the Eurozone has now is that whatever happens from here on is going to be difficult. There is no easy way out of this. For Spain, pretty much everything has to go right for Spanish membership of the Eurozone to be sustainable. So they need to push through the reforms of their labour markets and product markets. But on the other side, we need to see a program, a growth program across the Eurozone as a whole. So they need expansionary macroeconomic policies across the Eurozone, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary side. Now, Spain can't clearly implement a fiscal stimulus program, but other members of the Eurozone can. Germany, for example, has plenty of scope to boost demand through a program of fiscal stimulus. So they need expansionary macroeconomic policies. They need a central bank with a broader mandate. At the moment, the ECB's mandate is simply just to target inflation. They need to perform more fully the role of lender of last resort. So they need to step into the markets and ensure that asset prices remain realistic and aligned with sort of underlying fundamentals. So you need an activist central bank, expansionary macroeconomic policies, and ultimately they need to become jointly responsible to a degree for each other's debts. Because at the moment, Spain is damned if it does, damned if it doesn't. If it cuts public spending, investors or the market start to fear for its growth prospects and hence the sustainability of its debts. If it doesn't cut and it reneges on its commitments to narrow its fiscal deficit, then we see an adverse market reaction. So whatever they do is negative. They're locked in a self-defeating kind of cycle, if you like. At present, there's no way out of that. What's going to happen in Spain is going to mirror what the risk is that what we see in Spain over the next year, 18 months, is a repeat of what we've seen in Greece, Ireland, Portugal. It won't be exactly the same, and Spain is fundamentally a stronger economy than Greece, But cuts of the order of magnitude we're seeing in Spain now are simply going to depress that economy even further. The economy is already contracting pretty rapidly. Yes. They have a huge debt problem, particularly on the private side. If the economy contracts this year by 2 or 3%, the ratio of debt to GDP in Spain is going to balloon irrespective of how much they cut public spending by. In fact, the cuts in public spending could actually be, in such a depressed economic environment, be negative for the debt to GDP ratio, much as we've seen in Greece, Ireland and Portugal, who have been pursuing policies of considerable fiscal austerity for several years now, and we're seeing a dramatic build-up in debt.
Yes, the debts are getting bigger rather than smaller, so clearly austerity isn't working on that level, if that's the case. So this solution that you're proposing makes a lot of sense, and I'm reminded by the line that was once said about Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace, that it's a great idea, now all we need is the agreement of 1,000 German princes. How are you going to get 1,000 German princes to behave like Americans?
Well, this is the problem. It's far from clear that the Germans are going to blink. The problem is that the longer the crisis goes on, the further they're going to have to move. Had they moved, say, 2 years ago, they could have got away with much smaller institutional changes than are going to be ultimately necessary if they let the crisis fester. The longer this goes on, the bigger the losses are going to be for Germany. Ultimately, they're going to pay one way or another for this, but the current strategy maximises their potential exposure, both on the economic side and the political side. So that ultimately, this is going to cost them steadily more. But also politically, if they let things fester, the kind of the degree of debt mutualisation we're going to have to see to stabilise things is going to get steadily bigger. 2 years ago, they could have got away with a very limited fiscal union, some kind of debt mutualisation, but fairly limited. That's no longer an option. So the risk is that the longer it goes on, the less likely we're going to see the necessary political changes.
Is the euro a doomsday machine?
In its current structure, I think that's a fair description. It's basically a recreation of the gold standard.
In the middle of a democracy?
Yeah. So they've imposed a gold standard structure on the world's most generous welfare state, on countries with the world's most generous welfare states. Now, in a gold standard environment, basically Labour bears the full cost of adjustment in any sort of economic crisis. The idea that that is going to happen in Spain and Italy, I think, is fanciful. It's happened to an extent in Greece and Portugal and Ireland, but it's gone along with a massive rise in Euroscepticism in those countries, and it's discredited mainstream political forces in all three of those countries. But they're small countries that can be bullied. Spain and Italy are not. They're also largely closed economies in the sense that trade doesn't account for much economic activity, say 30, 35%. In Ireland, they say it's 100%. So there is a safety valve there. Yeah? And also there's labour mobility in Ireland's case and Portugal's case. In Spain and Italy's case, that's not the case.